It's Friday, the 3rd of February, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the UK sees the biggest day of strike action in more than a decade as the main parties clash over how to respond.
Is the Prime Minister going to get a grip and negotiate with working people?
The party opposite would do well to say that the strikes are wrong and we should be backing our school children.
As waiting times in A&E departments continue to rise, the government comes forward with a new plan for emergency care.
We are committed to year-on-year improvement in A&E waiting times. By next March, we want 76% of patients to be seen within 4 hours.
Isn't it the truth that they miss the targets, so they are moving the goalposts, fiddling the figures rather than fixing the crisis?
In Holyrood, the Scottish Government announces a pause on the movement of transgender prisoners.
No transgender person already in custody with any history of violence against women, including sexual offences against women, will be moved from the male to the female estate.
It seems the First Minister has abandoned her self-ID policy for prisons. Or is it just the case that women's safety and dignity only matters to the SNP when it makes front-page news?
No new oil!
And the government's bill to tackle disruptive protests hits the buffers in the House of Lords.
The whole point of protest is that it disrupts life to some point, so that you notice it, so that you start debating it.
We are listening to the public, and we are listening to the public who are fed up with seeing day after day protesters blocking roads.
Let's start with the strike, Susan, because this week we saw the largest day of industrial action in over a decade as hundreds of thousands of workers from across various sectors walked out over pay and conditions. And it comes after the government strikes bill was debated in the House of Commons on Monday. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so this strikes bill is a reaction to that disruption that you've just mentioned. However, it probably wouldn't have any effect on the current strikes because it takes quite a long time for a bill to become law. And I think probably everyone hopes that the strikes will have been resolved by the time it does become law. What it does, though, is try to guarantee a minimum level of service in vital public services on strike days, for example, in the NHS. So it would mean that some people would be obliged to work even on strike days or else face the sack. Now, opposition parties are appalled by that. They say it's curtailing people's right to strike. However, there was also a bit of opposition from a former Conservative minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Not because he opposes the idea behind the bill. He believes in this guarantee of minimum service. But he's not happy with the way the bill's been written. He says it gives far too much power to ministers to make little changes at a later stage without having anyone else have a look in on that. So he is hoping that the House of Lords, or what they like to call the other place in the House of Commons, that they'll make changes to that. However, at the moment, the government's definitely sticking to its guns.
It is well known that the first and foremost job of any government is to keep the public safe. Every one of us in this chamber will know of people who have been impacted by industrial action. Every one of us will know constituents who work hard and expect access to essential and life-saving services when they need them. We need to maintain a reasonable balance between the ability of workers to strike and the ability to keep the lives and livelihoods of the British public safe.
We are in an absurd situation. We're back today to debate the Conservatives' sacking nurses bill. And not just nurses, but millions of other key workers too. This bill is controversial and decisive. It is irrational as it is impractical and strongly condemned by all opposition parties.
I think the bill should set out clearly what it is trying to achieve, so I will end by an appeal to the other place. I hope that when it gets there they will look at clause 3 of the bill with extreme care that they will not be abashed by whatever majority comes from this House on the bill, to amend it, to strengthen the bill, to make it more effective, to ensure that it achieves its objectives and sets out in a good and proper constitutional way what it is trying to achieve.
The reality is workers withdraw their labour as a last resort, given that they suffer their own financial penalty in withdrawing their labour. But if strikes do not have some form of disruptive effect, then the strikes carry no leverage, allowing employers to have carte blanche to impose real-term wage cuts and key workers or change terms and conditions unilaterally.
Now, there was a stark warning, Susan, from the International Monetary Fund on Tuesday that the UK's economy will shrink and perform less well than other comparable advanced economies, including even sanctions hit Russia this year and perhaps next. MPs were quite concerned about this, weren't they?
Well, opposition MPs were certainly concerned about it. If government-side MPs were concerned, they kept it quiet because actually very few of them came along. What had happened was Labour had called for the Chancellor of the Exchequer to come along and answer some questions about it. In truth, opposition parties didn't really want to ask any questions. What they wanted to do was say their piece about it. The Chancellor of the Exchequer hadn't come along. He'd sent a junior minister instead. So we heard lots from the opposition about blaming the government for economic mismanagement, as they put it, for Liz Truss's mini-budget and blaming Brexit. And so it was left for this junior minister to stick up for the government and say, no, it's all because of COVID and the war in Ukraine.
The actions we are taking, from unleashing innovation across AI, financial services and a host of other sectors, to improving technical education and protecting infrastructure investment, will spur and fuel economic growth in the years to come, benefiting industry and communities alike. However, Mr. Speaker, the figures from the IMF do confirm that we are not immune to the pressures hitting nearly all advanced economies. We agree with the IMF's focus on the high level of inflation in our country, which is why it is our top priority.
The IMF chief economist singles out higher mortgage rates as a reason for Britain's poor performance. The Tory mortgage penalty is devastating family finances and holding back our economy. And British businesses are paying the price for the gaping holes in the Tories' Brexit deal. It will fall to Labour to clean up this mess. Now, if the Chancellor had ideas, answers or courage, he would be here today. But he is not.
She talks about 13 years of failure. Let me just repeat the actual facts of the matter. Since 2010, the UK has grown faster than France, Japan and Italy. The Shadow Chancellor talks about the next 2 years. As I said, the forecast is, from the IMF, is that cumulative growth over the 22-24 period is predicted to be higher in the UK than Germany and Japan, and at a similar rate to the US.
Will the Minister take this opportunity to reflect on last year when, despite the headwinds of the coronavirus, an invasion of Ukraine, huge hikes in energy costs, rising interest rates, high inflation in this country, the UK's businesses managed to generate over 4.1% of economic growth, twice the economic growth of the United States, 25% higher than economic growth in China and higher than the Eurozone.
Well, the chair of the Select Committee is spot on. Instead of talking down our economy, Mr. Speaker, she is making the key point that despite all of those challenges, we had strong growth last year, and the reason is because of British enterprise.
I suppose it's opposite. There's an urgent question on a potential recession on the third anniversary of Brexit. The IMF have said that the UK economy would face a downgrade, the only G7 country to be facing recession, reflecting, they say, tighter fiscal and monetary policies and the still high energy retail prices weighing on household budget. And there's no getting away from it. With even sanctioned Russia forecast to grow, this is a gloomy prognosis.
He talks about the cost of energy bills. That's precisely why this winter a typical household in the United Kingdom will have received £1,300 of support, £1,400 in cost of living payments, and the energy price guarantee estimated by the OBR to be worth £900 for the typical household. That's support provided to every single part of the United Kingdom.
The UK economy has faced a triple whammy in recent days. The IMF forecast saying that the UK is the only major economy which will slide into recession this year, an ONS survey setting out the true horror of this winter of discontent, and insolvency figures out today showing more companies going bust than at any point since the 2009 crisis. Can the Minister tell me when and where will the Brexit benefits begin?
She talks about the winter of discontent. As I said, £1,300 of support for a typical family this winter with their energy bills. That shows we're on their side, but we need to go further, and we do that by delivering on the target to halve inflation.
Will you also explain to my constituents why they've sent the cabin boy, the ship of shame over there, no crew there, no captain, no first mate, and they send the captain's cabin boy to answer questions on this most vital question of the moment?
Can I just say, he's an elder statesman of this House. I'm sure he can be pleasant if he really tried to.
Oh, a little bit of a telling off there from the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, to the Labour MP, Barry Shearman. Thanks for that for the moment, Susan. We'll be back to you later on. Let's go to Edinburgh, to Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, talk to Jenny Davidson, our political reporter there. Hello to you, Jenny. We talked last week about controversy around a transgender rapist who'd been sent to a woman's prison. And there have been further developments on that, haven't there?
That's right. So this is the case of Isla Bryson, a transgender rapist who last week was placed into Cornton Vale Women's Prison while being risk assessed, or then moved out into a male prison afterwards. And over the weekend, Justice Secretary Keith Brown announced there would be a pause in the transfer of transgender prisoners who had a history of violence against women, including sexual offences, while two reviews were carried out. Now, the first review is a rapid case review of this particular case of Isla Bryson, and then there's a much broader review going on within the Scottish Prison Service, starting in 2019, into how it should handle transgender prisoners, and that's expected to report later this year. Now, Keith Brown made a statement to Parliament about this change on Tuesday, but he was challenged about why there hadn't been a change made in response to a previous case of a transgender woman prisoner, Katie Dolotovsky, who was also transferred into Cornton Vale Prison last year.
Until these reviews are complete, no transgender person already in custody with any history of violence against women, including sexual offences against women, will be moved from the male to the female estate. In addition, no newly convicted or remanded transgender prisoner with any history of violence against women will be placed in the female estate. For clarity, this definition includes any history of violence, including sexual offences. It's felt that following through with robust risk assessment and taking account of all relevant factors, there are still exceptional circumstances in particular cases that will require the approval of ministers. This is not dissimilar to the situation which was announced last week in England and Wales.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ministers intervened and overturned the decision to send double rapist Isla Bryson to a female prison. Yet, an equally violent sex pest, Katie Dolotovsky, was sent to Cornton Vale last year with no questions asked. It seems the First Minister has abandoned her self-ID policy for prisons. Or is it just the case that women's safety and dignity only matters to the SNP when it makes front-page news?
And why has the government repeatedly defended the SPS risk assessment as being robust, when clearly it was not robust because, as previously mentioned, these risk assessment rules allowed a paedophile to go to Cornton Vale, and ministers knew it because I raised it directly with them. If there are any lessons to be learned here, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it's also the government that should learn some lessons to include the safety of women when they're looking at prison policy?
Now, we're likely to hear more on this soon because Holyrood's Criminal Justice Committee has said it wants to hear from Keith Brown and also the head of the Scottish Prison Service once that first urgent review into the Isla Bryson case has been completed.
Jenny, the issue was also raised at First Minister's questions, wasn't it?
Yes, so the Scottish Conservatives were complaining on Tuesday that it was Keith Brown giving the statement rather than the First Minister, but they got to put questions to the First Minister on Thursday instead. Now, Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross was asking if the First Minister considered Isla Bryson to be a woman. Now, this follows Justice Secretary Keith Brown saying that he would take people's gender at face value, and he would consider her to be a woman. Now, Nicola Sturgeon was quite equivocal initially, saying she didn't really have enough information about this specific case to decide, but then she appeared to come to a stronger conclusion in response to a testimony, a statement from one of Isla Bryson's victims.
This survivor was raped by him and said this on Sunday: "I don't believe a word. I don't believe he's truly transgender. I feel as if he's made a mockery out of them using it. As far as I'm concerned, that was to make things easier for himself. I'm sure he's faking it."
The quote that Douglas Ross narrated there, my feeling is that is almost certainly the case, which is why the key factor in this case is not the individual's claim to be a woman. The key and, in fact, only important factor in this case is that the individual has been convicted of rape. Yeah. The individual is a rapist, and that is the factor that should be the deciding one in decisions about how that prisoner is now treated. And indeed, that is what is happening in terms of where the prisoner is.
Now, this whole case just demonstrates some of the challenges about the whole situation. The Scottish Government wants to trust people in how they self-identify, to take that at face value, but also needs to protect others from those who might be acting in bad faith and seeking to find loopholes in the system.
Yes, Jenny, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that particular case. And also, at this week's First Minister's Questions, Labour raised concerns about funding for councils in the Scottish budget. Why are they worried?
Well, yes, this comes ahead of the first stage budget debate, or this came ahead of the first stage budget debate. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly around council budgets this year. Obviously, budgets everywhere under pressure, but Labour leader Anas Sarwar said that councils were at financial breaking point. He also quoted two senior SNP councillors who are part of the local government representative body, COSLA, talking about potential cuts. Yes, councils ahead of the budget were saying they needed £1 billion more overall. The Scottish Government is saying it's given a cash terms increase of £570 million, which equates to a real terms increase of over £160 million in this year's budget. But councils are saying that a lot of that, most of that, is taken up by Scottish Government commitments, that a lot of their funding, the majority, is just ring-fenced. They don't have much option about making changes. So that means cuts are going to come in a small number of areas, they're warning. Things like libraries, things like roads, things like waste and recycling, where they do have control over their own budgets. Now, Labour had a leaked document from this council body, COSLA, predicting what the level of job losses could be like.
And now a leaked COSLA document reveals potential job losses on a massive scale. They estimate over 7,000 jobs will be lost. 7,000. And this is what council leaders in her own party say. This budget settlement will have a detrimental impact on vital local services. It will lead to the loss of jobs both within local authorities and within the local companies who supply goods and services to councils. After 15 years of command and control, things have gone so bad that many of Nicola Sturgeon's own colleagues are no longer willing to blindly follow the orders. Her MPs have lost faith in the strategy. Her councillors have lost faith in her decisions, and now her MSPs face a choice. Will they vote through these cuts, or will they finally stand up for their local communities?
Anas Sarwar has just demonstrated there, I think, that he does not yet deserve to be taken seriously in these exchanges, because, you know, absolutely correct to say that these are really difficult times for local government, as they are for central government when it comes to the allocation of resources. We have put a draft budget before Parliament, and I stress that word, draft budget. Parliament is about to debate it. So if there is, and all of the resources we have are allocated within that draft budget. So if it is Anas Sarwar's proposition that he would like to see more money go to local government, then that is a legitimate proposal to make. But he has to say where he wants us to take that money from, because it would have to come from the National Health Service or the police budget or other budgets.
And this comes, of course, a challenging time, and Labour were challenged by the First Minister to say where this extra money for councils would come from in the budget. There's the pressure of inflation, increasing demands and services, and of course demand for pay rises with, for example, teacher strikes ongoing.
Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament. Thank you very much. Let's return to Westminster and our parliamentary correspondent, Susan. On Monday, the Health Secretary, Steve Barkley, unveiled a plan to tackle the long waiting times that we're continuing to see in the NHS. What is his plan?
Yeah, well, it's a response to a winter of some pretty alarming stories of ambulances queuing outside hospitals, which are full, can't take patients, the ambulances can't get out again, people having long waits for ambulances. So the Health Secretary for England has come out with about £1 billion for an NHS recovery plan. That's including things like more ambulances, more hospital beds, and a plan to treat people more at home, virtual wards, they're calling it. Now, this has all been really quite welcomed. However, as far as it goes, some critics are saying it's not ambitious enough given the scale of the problems, and also where are the staff going to come from, the trained staff to make all of this happen?
Our plan has a number of commitments that are both ambitious and credible. First, we are committed to year-on-year improvement in A&E waiting times. By next March, we want 76% of patients to be seen within 4 hours. In the year after, we will bring waiting times towards pre-pandemic levels. Our second ambition, Mr. Speaker, is to improve ambulance response times, with a specific commitment to bring Category 2 response times, those emergency calls including for heart attacks and strokes, to an average of 30 minutes by next March. And again, in the following year, we will work to bring ambulance response times towards pre-pandemic levels. Virtual wards are also showing the way forward for hospital care at home, with a growing base of evidence showing that virtual wards are a safe and efficient alternative to being in hospital. Our aim is to have up to 50,000 people a month being supported away from hospitals in high-tech virtual wards.
After 13 years of Conservative mismanagement, patients are waiting longer than ever before. Heart attack and stroke victims are waiting more than an hour and a half for an ambulance. 24 hours in A&E isn't just a TV programme, it is the grim reality for far too many patients. The 4-hour A&E waiting time target hasn't been met since 2015. The only time the Conservatives have met the 18-minute target for ambulance response times was during lockdown. What's his ambition now? 30 minutes. 30 minutes waiting for a heart attack and stroke victim to receive an ambulance when every second counts. Isn't it the truth that they miss the targets, so they are moving the goalposts, fiddling the figures rather than fixing the crisis?
On ambition, he ignores the fact that we need to balance being ambitious but being realistic, and these metrics are, in the view of NHS England, the fastest sustained improvement in NHS history. So clearly he is at odds with NHS England.
The Royal College of Emergency Medicine says that we need 13,000 beds. The government is offering 5,000. The percentage of patients that need to be seen within 4 hours should be 95%. The government is aiming for 76. Heart attack and stroke victims should be seen within 18 minutes, and the government is only aiming for 30. Surely the truth of it is that this woeful lack of ambition means that our emergency care services are themselves on life support, and patients are going to continue to needlessly die for a very long time to come.
On the ambition of the targets, I think they've got to be realistic, but it's not a ceiling, it's a floor. It's about saying, how do we set a target that's realistic? Of course, we'll aim to do better than that, but it's about setting something that the system feels is achievable, because that, in turn, gets much more buy-in.
In the pandemic, the use of local private hospitals, particularly in places like Basingstoke, by the NHS, kept services like cancer care going uninterrupted. Could the NHS be using more private facilities more widely to relieve some of the pressures that my right honourable friend has so eloquently outlined in his statement?
I absolutely agree. We should be maximising the capacity. We had a very useful round table with the Prime Minister at Downing Street with the independent sector as to how we make more use of their capacity, and it's certainly an area we're exploring.
The waiting experience in our hospital is like being in a disaster zone, and they're not my words, but the words of my constituent. My constituent went on to explain about parents having to sit on floors and wait for hours to be able to be seen, or their children to be able to be seen by a doctor. So I pressed the Minister, is there a plan to return to the standard of 95% of patients who come to A&E to be seen within 4 hours?
We're not setting out that ambition in this statement because the impact of the pandemic has been so severe. We need to set an ambition which is a target that is ambitious but achievable, and that is what we have done.
Steve Barkley there, the Health Secretary. Susan, let's turn to Prime Minister's questions, because Rishi Sunak's judgment over whom he has placed at the top of the Cabinet with him was scrutinised by the Labour leader Keir Starmer. What were the details?
Well, this is the week that marks 100 days since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, and already he's lost 2 cabinet ministers, Sir Gavin Williamson and Nadeem Zahawi. And the opposition is very definitely circling around a third, Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister. He's under investigation over allegations that he bullied staff. He was in the Commons. He was sitting next to the Prime Minister, exactly, for Prime Minister's questions. And Keir Starmer had a lot of questions about whether Rishi Sunak knew about those allegations before he appointed him. Rishi Sunak stuck to his line that he knew about no formal allegations. And I think Keir Starmer could see a bit of a theme emerging. He was trying to make it emerge, because he also kept asking about Nadeem Zahawi, who was sacked last weekend, and whether the Prime Minister had known about the issues over his tax affairs when he gave him a job.
In the interests of integrity and accountability, can he set the record straight? Did his now former chair tell government officials that he was under investigation by the taxman before or after the Prime Minister appointed him?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I appointed the independent adviser to investigate this matter fully. He has set out his findings in detail over the weekend, and on receipt of those findings, I took action, and I refer the honourable gentleman to the independent adviser's report.
Keir Starmer. Oh, come on! Anyone picking up a newspaper in July last year would have known that HMRC and the National Crime Agency were investigating months before he appointed him. Mr. Speaker, The Independent, 6th of July, new Chancellor's finances secretly investigated by the National Crime Agency. Is he saying his officials hid this information from him, or was he just too incurious to ask any questions?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before at the dispatch box, the usual appointments process was followed with respect to the Minister without portfolio. No issues were raised with me at the time of his appointment, but as the independent adviser's report makes clear, there was a serious breach of the ministerial code, and that's why I took decisive action on receipt of that report.
So for his former chair, nobody told me, I didn't know, I didn't ask any questions. Is the Prime Minister now also going to claim that he's the only person completely unaware of serious allegations of bullying against the Deputy Prime Minister before he appointed him?
If he is so concerned about what people are saying and is so concerned about behaviour in public life, then recently one of his own MPs was forced to speak out because being in his party had reminded her of being in an abusive relationship. And then his own office was caught undermining her. He ought to be supporting her and her colleagues, but if he can't be trusted to stand up for the women in his party, he can't be trusted to stand up for Britain.
At the last count, the Deputy Prime Minister was facing 24 separate allegations of bullying. According to recent reports, some of the complainants were physically sick. One says they were left suicidal. How would he feel if one of his friends or relatives was being forced to work for a bully simply because the man at the top was too weak to do anything about it?
Mr. Speaker, I noticed he didn't say anything about why one of his own MPs describes being in his own party. And Mr. Differ, when I was made aware of formal complaints, I instructed a leading independent KC to conduct an investigation, because I take action when these things happen.
Lively exchanges there at PMQ, Susan. As we mentioned, though, earlier, it was the biggest day of strike action in over a decade this week, but neither leader seemed keen to take the issue head-on.
No, well, you wouldn't think the strikes were exactly a good news story for the government, but actually Rishi Sunak seemed a bit frustrated that Keir Starmer didn't raise it because, of course, he likes to accuse Labour of being the strikers' friend. However, it was raised by a rank-and-file Labour MP.
The Prime Minister once said that he didn't have any working-class friends. So we may not be aware that today 500,000 hard-working people are on strike, including in his own constituency. Tory Britain isn't working. Is the Prime Minister going to get a grip and negotiate with working people, or does he intend being remembered as the PM who silenced and sacked hard-working nurses, paramedics, teachers, rail workers and firefighters in a cost-of-living crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to teachers, we've actually given teachers the highest pay rise in 30 years. It includes a 9% pay rise for newly qualified teachers and record investment in their training and development. I am clear that our children's education is precious and they deserve to be in school today being taught. And actually the party opposite would do well to say that the strikes are wrong and we should be backing our school children.
Susan, thank you very much for the moment. Let's talk to Chemlin Davis and go to Cardiff and the Senedd. Chemlin, senior figures of the Welsh Rugby Union gave evidence to a Senedd committee this week. That was because of allegations of a toxic culture within the organisation. Tell us a bit about it.
Yes, that's right. This committee hearing followed a turbulent and damaging 10 days for the Welsh Rugby Union. Last week, our Wales Investigates programme highlighted allegations of sexism, misogyny and racism within the organisation, and the fallout led to the resignation of the Chief Executive, Steve Phillips. Well, the acting Chief Exec, Nigel Walker, appeared before the Culture Committee here yesterday alongside the WRU's Chair, Ieuan Evans, to answer questions about all this.
We're very pleased to have the opportunity. We are aware as the stewards of Welsh Rugby that we have a great responsibility, and we're aware that we've disappointed the rugby family across Wales. The experience has been sobering for us, but as new chair I am determined to make the changes that are necessary.
I think in any organisation, especially a large organisation like the Welsh Rugby Union, it's possible for things to occur over a period of time and for people to turn a blind eye and not to address those problems. And then it's not until sometimes an organisation is forced to face the reality of the position they find themselves in that they begin to really look deeply and look back in the past and begin to join the dots. So the warning signs have been there for quite some time. When it's presented as graphically as it was during that programme, the BBC Wales programme, the week before last, it hits you like a 10-ton truck. I should offer my apologies, and my thoughts are with those members of staff, those players, ex-players, who have had an experience which no individual should have. The key now is, yes, we're apologetic. Yes, we've made statements. Yes, we've accepted we've got a problem. The key now is to begin to understand the scale and scope of that problem.
Nigel Walker there, and he also gave more details of the independent external task force that's now being set up to review the culture within the WRU. He said that will begin its work next week.
The committee then heard from the Welsh Government's Deputy Minister for Sport. What did she have to say?
Yes, well, Dawn Bowden confirmed that the Labour MP Tonia Antoniazzi had written to her last year, highlighting concerns that she had about issues within the WRU, and she said that she in turn had raised those matters with the organisation in general terms. But she said that in the absence of any substantiated complaints and any more details, that there was only so much that she was able to do.
There are constraints when you are a government minister. I did what I could in the best way that I could with the powers that were available to me as a government minister, given that I had nothing formal, I had no evidence, I had nothing other than what was in the public domain, and I have not a direct, if you like, governance role in the WRU.
Now, Dawn Bowden also told the committee that she wasn't aware of any similar issues within any other sporting bodies in Wales, but that wasn't to say that there aren't any. And one of her officials, who was also giving evidence, told the committee that all sporting bodies in Wales should be reflecting on this story and considering whether their own house is in order.
Now, Chemlin, there was great sadness and shock, I have to say, about the news of the death of the wife of the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, at the weekend, and tributes were paid by the Welsh Parliament on Tuesday.
That's right. The Welsh Government announced last Saturday that the First Minister's wife, Claire Drakeford, had passed away suddenly, as you say. Since then, there's been an outpouring of sympathy from across the political spectrum and across the UK. And on Tuesday, MSs were given an opportunity to pay their respects too, as they observed a minute's silence, led by the Senedd's presiding officer, the Llywydd Elin Jones, and the Welsh Government's business manager, the Trefnydd Lesley Griffiths.
It's little understood by people outside this chamber, but often what pains one of us can pain all of us. In this case, what pains the First Minister has touched many people throughout Wales. When the news broke on Saturday, the first asking for her condolences to be passed on to the First Minister and messaging me was a nurse in Bronglais. Mark and his family are in our hearts and prayers this afternoon. Many will have known Claire well. We will rise now to remember Claire and in love and support for our First Minister and his family.
I know the thoughts of everyone in the Senedd and across Wales are with our First Minister and his family at this very sad time, which I know he will greatly appreciate.
Having met Claire on several occasions in my role as leader here, but as an MS as well, I realised what a kind and compassionate individual she was and how dedicated they both were to each other. And I hope very much that the sentiments that everyone is expressing is a form of comfort, because I use the word form of comfort because nothing will ever make up for the loss of your partner in life. And I extend the Conservatives, the Welsh Conservatives, sympathies, prayers and best wishes to the family of the First Minister and to the First Minister himself.
It is a blow that's difficult to comprehend, if truth be told. And we want to ensure that he is aware how much support we wish to give him during this most difficult period.
So just some of the tributes there, Joe, to the First Minister's late wife, Claire Drakeford, who passed away last weekend.
Yes, heartfelt condolences there. Briefly, Chemlin, the Senedd didn't sit on Wednesday this week. Why not?
Yes, that was because of the strike on Wednesday. Strikes across the UK, of course, and here in Cardiff Bay, members of the Commission staff were on strike in solidarity with their fellow members of the PCS union. So the Commission of the Senedd decided that they wouldn't be sitting on Wednesday, and the business that was planned for that day will be rearranged.
Thank you very much, Chemlin Davis, there in Cardiff. Let's return to Susan Hume, who's still with me here, our parliamentary correspondent, and talk about the House of Lords this week, where the government's controversial public order bill, which would make protests that cause what's been termed serious disruption illegal. It faced a major setback after peers voted to change it, and it was quite a dramatic session.
It was. There was a protest as they debated protests. Demonstrators interrupted the Lib Dem peer, Lord Paddock, who is in fact a bit of a supporter of theirs, at least because he thinks that the bill goes much too far in trying to clamp down on demonstrators. For example, the government wants to stop things like the demonstrations we've seen where people have glued themselves to motorways or chained to overhead motorway gantries and held up traffic for hours. These demonstrators in the Lord's Chamber, they didn't hold things up for hours, just for a few minutes before the doorkeepers ejected them. But let's see what panned out.
Sometimes when we get irritated if protest disrupts our lives, and clearly there have to be limits. But many of these amendments simply go too far. They will have a chilling effect on protests and protesters. It will undermine one of the fundamental freedoms we all enjoy, of standing up to injustice as we see it.
I have, as I've told the House before, considerable experience of public order policing, and my view is that the police have sufficient powers without any of the measures contained in this bill. And in fact, that is a view of many serving police officers who were interviewed by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services, some of whom referred to the powers that currently exist as an armoury of powers to use in public order policing. My Lords, Amendment 1, to which I have added my...
A moment of your time. In 80 days, people will come, tens of thousands of people outside these gates.
We now are going to vote very soon on whether or not to declare a protest is illegal if it disrupts somebody. The whole point of protest is that it disrupts life to some point, so that you notice it, so that you start debating it, so that it gets reported in the newspapers. It's incredibly important, in a sense, that protest is disruptive.
I think ultimately it may come down to whether or not your lordships consider that the right to protest is so fundamental that it must trump the rights of ordinary people going about their everyday lives. It is a difficult balance to strike, but though I respect profoundly the right to protest and have sympathy for many of the relevant causes, it seems to me that one has to counterbalance the rights of others to go about their life. These rights are entitled to protection too.
The government wants to protect the rights of the public to go about their daily lives without let or hindrance. I do not believe that the Noble Lord's amendment supports this aim, therefore I cannot support it. My Lords, I make no secret of what the government is trying to do. We are listening to the public, and we are listening to the public who are fed up with seeing day after day protesters blocking roads. They make children late for school, they make people miss hospital appointments, they make small businesses struggle.
There's certainly been a lot of debate around that bill, hasn't there, Susan? Before we go, what are we expecting in Parliament next week?
Well, a few things have caught my eye. There isn't much legislation, new laws being made. I think maybe because this is the week before they have a week off and they often don't do so much heavy lifting then. We will hear from the Chancellor. There's questions to Treasury Ministers, quite a bit to ask him about, that IMF report we were talking about earlier. And, of course, interest rate rises. And a bit of good news, the Bank of England reckons that, well, we'll have a recession. It won't be quite as bad as people had thought. There's some interesting committee hearings. Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, is appearing before MPs following the controversy about his relationship with Boris Johnson before he got the job. And there's one other thing that piqued my interest. The Women and Equalities Committee is looking at music and misogyny. I can't tell you much more about it than that, but it sounds like it could be quite an interesting session then.
Well, it sounds like there is quite a lot going on next week for people to tune into. Thank you very much, Susan, and to everyone. That's all for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.